Hi there, and welcome to the first of a series of videos looking at joomla4 component development, and in particular what you have to do to upgrade your Joomla version 3 component to version 4. And in this first video we're going to be looking at namespacing. But before we start into that, I'm just going to show a couple of links for useful documentation. The first one is the Joomla3 MVC tutorial, and all the stuff that's going to be covered in this video and the series of videos is going to be on this page. The second one is there is a version 4 of the Joomla MVC tutorial. So we've been looking at version 3, but there is a version 4. However, it seems to be very much a work in progress, so it just goes down to step 8. So maybe that will be completed a bit more in the future, or you may fancy completing it yourself. Astrid Günther has done a tutorial not just on component development, but on covering things like plugins and modules and templates as well. So you may want to have a look at that. There's a lot of good useful stuff there. And the fourth thing is there's a book on Joomla extension development which has been written by one of the key Joomla developers, and it's here, and this is really excellent. It's the best kind of component development or documentation for developers of extensions that I've come across, so it's well worth looking at that. As well as that, these slides that I'm showing here are going to be available via my Google Drive, and I'll put the link in the YouTube description. And also just to be aware that Joomla4 is fairly new. When I was upgrading the tutorial, there were a few bugs I found, so it's not totally stable yet. So if anything I say here is inaccurate, I'll try and update these slides with the correct information, and also put stuff into the link in the YouTube link in the notes field of the YouTube video, so check those for any updates or corrections. Right, let's get started with namespacing. If you're not familiar with namespacing, it's worth looking through this, which is the PHP documentation relating to namespaces. Worth having a look through that so that you become familiar with what it's all about. And in that book I mentioned, there's also a little chapter there about namespaces and what you have to do with Joomla to get namespacing to work. Namespacing was kind of introduced in Joomla 3 versions. I think one of the first ones we came across, this is the Hello World model from Joomla 3 in the administrator area, the Hello World PHP model. And you notice down here this use statement. One of the first classes that we used in its namespaced form was the Joomla registry class. Now with Joomla4, Joomla in itself is pretty much all namespaced, and the key thing is that it really is expecting extensions to be namespaced too, so that's components, modules, plugins, everything. And they use a standard called the PSR4 standard, and that is described here. And this standard really relates to if you've got a fully qualified name with a namespace plus class name, how does that relate to where it's stored on your file system? That's the key thing which PSR4 recommendation gives you, and that is what is used by Joomla. So whenever we are going to be namespacing our components, it's on the basis of that PSR4 standard. So what are the steps involved in namespacing your component? Well, the first thing is to decide on a namespace prefix. That's kind of like the start of this bit here of your fully qualified name. Now if you look in Joomla, we'll just go down here to namespacing. Joomla goes with this sort of convention here for its components, Joomla, component, and then the component name. So for example, it's got Joomla, component, and content for content. And the first bit here is really supposed to relate to whoever has developed that, so your company name or something like that. So I've just put there Robbie, and the key thing is that it has to be distinct, it has to be unique. So that's why if you call it something along the lines of your company name, it should pretty much be distinct. And then we've got component and then hello world. So that's the namespace prefix. The next thing is we decide on a source folder name. Now the standard way that Joomla has adopted is to call this folder name source, src. And if we look at the file system, you'll see under com hello world, and if you look at other components as well, you'll see an src directory, and that src directory is where these source files of your classes are going to be stored. And there's one there for the administrator, and there's another one for the site there. And the way that you specify this namespace is in your XML manifest file. So if we look at that, we've got a line here which specifies your namespace. So I've got Robbie component hello world, and I've got the path as being src. So all my files are going to, all my class files are going to be stored under src. And what Joomla will do with that namespace is it will create two namespace prefixes. If we go back to here, we can see that. So here's a Joomla instance on the left hand side, and it'll create two, as I say, two namespace prefixes. One is /Robbie component hello world administrator, and that one, it will point at the source folder within our administrator com hello world files. The second, it will be Robbie component hello world site, and it will point that at the equivalent src directory down in the components, in the site components area there. Now if you've followed the same sort of pattern as regards development folder, as is shown in the joomla4 tutorial, then in the development folder we've got an admin folder and we've got a site folder, and these will then map to the src subfolders within admin and site. I mean, you don't have to have this sort of thing, but because you can change it so that whenever you have your manifest file, you just got to say where your folders are for your site and for your administrator. But assuming that you've followed what has been done in the joomla4 tutorial, you'll have this sort of setup. So these files here under src will then be installed under here, and for the site ones under here, they will be stored under there. So as I say, Joomla, whenever it gets your manifest file, it will create these two prefixes, and it will expect your source files to be under those two prefixes. This one for your administrator PHP class files, and this one for your site one. And I was looking at the code, Joomla code, and what it does when it starts up, it goes through the file system, and it looks for all the manifest files, all of these kind of hello world.xml files, processes those and finds all of the namespace lines in them, and then it creates a file with all of these namespaces in them, and it puts that in administrator cache, and you can see autoload psr4.php, and you can see there all of the namespace prefixes that has created from all of the Joomla components. pretty much just got Joomla components on this, but I've got the Hello World installed on it as well. So if you look down the bottom, here is my site and here is my administrator, and where they're pointing to is components. If we look over here, this is the administrator, components Hello World SRC, and this is the site, components Hello World SRC. So it must be a lot of work to actually go through all the manifest files and create all of these lists, this list of namespace prefixes, which is probably why it's actually stored as a cache in there. And if you delete it and then kind of make an HTTP call to Joomla, you'll find it has been reconstituted. I'm not really sure why the Joomla team don't just actually put the namespaces in the extensions table. It seems to be quite natural to put it there when you install stuff, but maybe there might be some change coming on in Joomla to make it a bit easier to get to the namespaces. Anyway, back to our slides here. So we've decided on namespace prefix, and we've decided on a folder name, and say Joomla will use those, what you specify in your manifest file, to determine where you have got your PHP class files. Now after that, it's a matter of going through all of your class files, your Joomla4, your Joomla3 class files, and shifting them into this new structure. But not only that, you have to change the names of the classes and include namespace in your file. So let's take an example. This is the administrator Hello World model. If we look at the equivalent under Joomla3, this is the administrator model. So under Joomla4, we need to put this namespace in, right? So there is our namespace prefix going down to administrator, and because it's in the model subdirectory, we add on that model, and then we add on the class name, which is Hello World model, which must match the name of the file, right? So the prefix kind of gets us down to this SRC directory, and then the following segments really specify the folders that we go down through, ending up with the class name itself. Just to give another example, we have got a modal field here, which we use whenever we select a Hello World record. For example, whenever you want to select create a menu item to point to a Hello World record, then you will use this modal field to select the Hello World record. And you can see in this, the namespace, there's administrator. Sorry, let me just open this. There's the administrator prefix, and then we've got field, modal, Hello World field, and that matches the directory structure field, modal, Hello World field. So that is the key thing which PSR4 standard or recommendation gives us, is to go from our prefix base SRC folder, how do we get to the class? So getting back to what we need to do, we need to set this namespace in. We need to set the class name then, because we have changed it from this Hello World model Hello World to the much simpler version of just Hello World model. In Joomla3, all of these were in the global namespace, so you had to make sure that there was no clashing between components. So as part of that, Joomla had the convention of putting the component name as part of the class name, but now because we've got namespacing, we don't need to do that, and we can simplify all of these here, these class names. So I did have found with upgrading to Joomla4, there's no easy way to do it in an incremental manner. You just have to go and change everything. Get all of the namespacing done, all of the other bits and pieces done, and then try and run it, and then tackle all your problems that you find. It's just a big change, and you really just have to do it, in one fell swoop, as far as I can see. Anyway, the source folder, it's changed from what you would have had under Joomla 3.10. For example, we've got model, but we've got separate ones for field and rule, and some of those we had under the model in the past. So it's more of a flat structure. We still have these kind of subdirectories for modal things, but in general it's a lot flatter and a lot easier to use than the Joomla 3 one. Note, however, the view ones are going to be a little bit different. We can see this more in the site, because we've got the view name, but we've also got the type of output that the view is creating. So whenever we're looking at the RSS feeds, we've got a feed view, and if we're responding to AJAX messages, we've got a JSON view. So there are different types of view that come under the view name. So you just have to be aware that that's a bit different from the other classes. Right, get back to these slides. Okay, so in general, Joomla will know how to get to your class file name in order to find your PHP class. However, there are two instances where it won't know that automatically, and the first is in XML for forms, and the second is, it's related to that, is when you programmatically generate the XML for a form. So whenever you've got, for example, rule classes, this is where you have a validation against a particular type of variable that you're picking out in a form. So for example, greeting, we have got a greeting validation there, and so we use a rule to do that, and it's just in our greeting rule here. And when we have something like this in a form, we need to add the prefix. So we need to add the namespace prefix, so that Joomla, whenever it's processing that form, knows where to find the rule. And similarly, if we've got a field that we're picking out, and there's an example there, whenever we set up a menu item to a single Hello World record, we will be picking out a Hello World record. So just to remind you, whenever we create a Hello World record there, this is the menu, and we're selecting then a Hello World record here, and this field here is generated by this field here, which is the modal Hello World field. But because this is in our own kind of directory area, we need to tell Joomla, we need to add in that add field prefix, so that we're adding in again the namespace here. It's in the administrator area in the field subdirectory, and then modal Hello World will then map to modal and then Hello World field. So those are two, that's a couple of cases where you have to add in these field prefixes in the XML files. And also whenever you are programmatically creating parts of XML, there was, I think it might have been in the Hello World's view, simple XML. No, I can't see it there. But there are places where we have to programmatically add the view, and then, programmatically generate part of the XML form file. And if we're adding in associations and we're using the Hello World record, modal Hello World record, to pick an associated Hello World record, then we add that programmatically, because we want to avoid adding one for the same language. So we're adding that, and we also are using that modal hello world field, so we will need to add in the same prefix to that in order for Joomla to find where that field is defined. Right, so that's that. The other thing we need to do is, if you have something like exception, if we look in this hello world model here, I think we have an example. Nope, hello world model. There it is. Okay. So this is where we throw an exception. Now, exception is one of the standard PHP classes. However, if we've got a namespace declared at the top of this here, and then we use something like exception here, then if we don't do this thing here, add the backslash in front, PHP will assume that this exception is a class which is under this namespace here, and it will fail because it can't find one. So to get around that problem, we add in this, and this backslash really is indicative to PHP that this is a fully qualified name, and this fully qualified name is just exception within the global namespace. So it will automatically then go to the global namespace to find this exception class rather than within our namespace here. I should say that it does the same for you can namespace functions, ordinary functions, and you get the same sort of issue, that it will take as that if you define a function, it will go into the namespace of this. So if you use a function, it will look first of all for that function within that namespace, but differently from class names, if it can't find it within that namespace, it will assume that it is within the global namespace. So for example, implode here is a standard PHP function, and sometimes in Joomla you will see the backslash in front of a function like that as well. It's just emphasize that it's in the global namespace, but I say it's not necessary because it will default to that if it can't find it in your ordinary namespace. Right, let's go back to that. So then when we're moving all of these files around our file system, we also have to move the other files. So things like forms now have got their own folder up here. So we move our forms away from our model forms up there, and also TMPL files are separate as well. And we're going to be looking at JS and CSS files when we look at the Web Asset Manager, but they will have to be moved as well. So a lot of restructuring of files around the place. Right, and it doesn't stop there because, as I mentioned before, Joomla was introducing these namespaces within version 3. In version 4, it's pretty much all namespaced, and really I think the recommendation is that we should then use the Joomla versions, the namespace versions, rather than things like JModelAdmin. We can still use JModelAdmin, we would just have to put it a backslash in front of it in order for it to find under joomla4, because it's in the global namespace. But it's at this point we really probably makes sense that we should adopt the Joomla standard fully qualified names as well. So this involved changing, for example, JText to text everywhere, and then you put in a use statement, use this, which basically means that wherever you see text here, it means this fully qualified name. And there is, if you look at this link here, there is a list of all of the obsolete classes. So all of these ones here with the Joomla namespace equivalent. So for example, JTable, you would put change to table, and you would have use statement for that in your source file. So whenever you're going through, it's worth it keeping a scratch pad of all the use statements just in a file so you can copy and paste, because you get the same ones coming up time and again. And it's obviously very easy to miss things. So recommendation is to look for a capital J in your source files as well, to make sure that you've got all of these class names changed from JText to text and all those sorts of things. Joomla itself has got, in the libraries area, has got a couple of namespaces. So whenever you look at Joomla files, they are, and whenever you look at, for example, our use statements, we have got a number of things here. So you've got Joomla CMS, and a lot of these start with Joomla CMS, and Joomla CMS points to libraries/source. So if we take, for example, where are we? We'll look at Joomla CMS factory, and we look at our file system under libraries, under source, and we will find, sorry, give me a minute. Joomla CMS factory will go to Joomla library source, and we will find it under there. There is our factory.php file there. Most of them will be under directories. So if we're taking a better example, probably would be CMS MVC model item model, that one, which will be found in under source again, MVC model, and there's your item model there. So that's one of the Joomla library namespaces. The other is, if you don't have a CMS there, if you've got some other thing, it's under libraries, vendor, Joomla, and then that thing and source. So if we take another example here, we've got Joomla registry, which will be found under Joomla libraries vendor, Joomla, registry, source, and there's our file there, registry.php. If you don't have Joomla, some of these are like PSR. You do have one or two of these in your code, and those are under libraries vendor PSR, and you'll find those again under that, not under Joomla but under PSR, for example. But there are very few of those in the tutorial code. The other thing to note about these two library namespaces is it matches the API documentation. So if we look at the API documentation, which is here, we've got two areas here. One is the CMS, and this is the set of documentation for all of the ones under that Joomla CMS namespace, all of these. And the other one is under framework, and you will find all of these under there. So for example, there's our registry there, and under the CMS we should be able to find things like MVC model. So that's that. Just some advantages in namespacing. It really is beneficial. The whole namespacing concept makes it so much easier. It's a bit of a pain to shift all your code to it, but once you're there, you'll never look back. In Joomla 3, you had to know 3 things whenever Joomla was calling some of your code. You had to know what your class was to be called, what the file name should be called where you store your file, store your class code, and where to store the file name in which directories. You need to know all those three things, and Joomla had conventions about where you stored one thing or another. In joomla4, all you need to know is the fully qualified class name. So if you see somewhere in the Joomla code that it's looking for some sort of a class, you can then work out using the PSR4 kind of recommendation where you need to put your file and what you need to call it and what you need to call your class name. So you just need to know this one thing, and then you can work out all the rest, which makes it so much easier. The second thing is it makes it easier to find Joomla classes. I don't know about you, but sometimes you're forced to look through the Joomla code and you come across some Joomla reference to some other class. And in Joomla3, you're always wondering about where is this file stored. Well, now under Joomla4, it makes it so much easier because we've only got two places depending upon the class name. If it's Joomla CMS.something, it's all under library source. If it's Joomla something else, not CMS, then it's somewhere under this vendor area, vendor Joomla. So it makes it so much easier to find where the Joomla code itself is, which you need to look at. It avoids clashing with Joomla class names. As a matter of interest, we had a form in our Joomla3 tutorial for the front end, and whenever we created the model, we called it form model, and there is a Joomla class name which is called form model, exactly the same thing as well, but because it's in a different namespace, that doesn't matter. So you can have names of classes which are the same, but because they're in a different namespace, that isn't going to be a problem. And one of the advantages of having this is that you can share code between the front end and the back end. So if we look at our front end under Joomla3, this is our admin hello world model, and this is our site hello world model. And you can see that the class names are the same. So how do you share code between class names which are the same? Very difficult. But under Joomla4 with the namespacing, they're different. So whereas the name in itself is still going to be the same hello world model, because it's going to be in a separate namespace, you can use that to, for example, extend one class against the other. So for example, the site model could extend the administrator model, and you just have to set up the namespaces correctly and you'll get that. So it makes it a lot easier to share code between the front end and the back end, enables you to use inheritance to share code, and you don't need to kind of do jimport or jload or register. However, there are a couple of things you need to be aware of. Some Joomla classes themselves have duplicate names, and we'll see MVC factory when we come to look at the services provider.php file. But just to be aware that sometimes you need to look at the use statements to find the fully qualified name, and not necessarily assume that a name that you think you know is what you expect. There are a couple of cases where Joomla isn't fully namespaced. For example, we had a site root helper file which we still need to provide under Joomla4. That's in this helpers directory. And this file is used to get roots for hello world and records or category records, and it's used whenever you if we go back from here, closing this, if you have a menu item which is pointing at something like a list of tags, and whenever that is output by the contags functionality, it will have links to those hello world records or whatever. Here's links here. And it needs to know what the root is, what it should put into the jroot file or call in order to get a link, create a link to that record. So that's why we have these get hello world, get category record here. And it just uses a non-namespace way of getting at them. Really, because the code in com tags doesn't have an easy way of getting the namespace for hello world. And we'll see a bit more about that when we look at it in a bit more detail in future videos. Right, and the final thing is, if we're looking at these APIs, if a Joomla CMS class extends a Joomla framework class, then some of the methods may not be detailed in the API documentation. So we've got our API documentation for CMS up here, and some of the classes here may extend some of the classes here. So if you're looking at the CMS class and you find that, oh, some of the methods you expected to find are missing, it could be because it's extending a Joomla framework class and the methods are in there. I found it whenever you were having to put out a status value associated with an HTTP response. Right, finally we come to class auto-loading, and this is really how Joomla uses the kind of PSR4 recommendation to find your classes. If you think about a Joomla instance, it's pretty enormous, so you're going to be using lots of different classes, and there's no way that you can tell PHP to kind of include all of these files so that it knows what all the class names are. It would just be horrendous in terms of response. And as well as that, you don't want to have to put in all the include statements in your own file. So the way that Joomla works is using the PHP feature, which is known as auto-loading. And if you're not aware of that, it's worth reading through this section on auto-loading classes. But basically what it gives you is it gives you an SPL autoload register function. And if Joomla can't find a class, so for example you have in your code new something class, or if class exists something, and give it the class name, and if Joomla, or if PHP doesn't know that, if you have an autoload registered function already registered, then PHP will call that function in order to see if your function can find that class for it. So the way Joomla works is it's somewhere here. It's in loader.php. So whenever Joomla initializes, it calls this setup function in JLoader, and here's a number of SPL autoload register function calls. And you see there's a number of these here because Joomla uses a number of ways of finding classes. We've talked about the PSR autoload class, and we've looked at that file there, which hopefully should be somewhere here, perhaps not. Let me just get that file again. Gosh. This is the PSR autoload function, or PSR autoload PSR PHP file, which has all the namespaces. So this is one way that Joomla uses to find classes. It has other ways as well. For example, if we go to libraries and classmap.php, it sets a number of aliases. For example, JRegistry, it will set as an alias to Joomla registry. And then there's another file, autoload class map, for example, and it will have a lot of the library calls there. We might just find Joomla registry. Joomla registry. and then that will point to where it's stored in the directory there. So Joomla uses a number of ways of finding classes, and particular for the PSR4 classes, if we go back to this, it's got a function which it says load by PSR. So if we look for that function, here's our load by PSR. So whenever PHP can't find a class, it will call this function load by PSR. It will pass the class name, and what this function here will do, you can see a comment there, look through registered namespaces until we find a match. So if we're looking, for example, Robbie component hello world administrator model hello world model, it will look through our PSR4 autoload, and it will come down here and it will find, lo and behold, Robbie component hello world administrator matches this line here. Right. And associated with that line will be this directory here. So it will go to that directory and it will be pointing to our source file here, source directory here. And it will take the other bits of the class name, which is model hello world, and it will go from that point down model and then hello world. So if we go from here, it will go into model hello world and it will open that, and that's where it will expect to find that class name. So in this way, using this autoloader feature, Joomla finds the class names for PHP using this PSR standard. And this is how it describes it here. Use the remain. It matches the fully qualified name against those namespaces it has in that cached file. When it finds it, uses the remainder to navigate down the folder structure to the file, and it does an include once on that file and returns to PHP. And if you called your PHP class names correctly, PHP will now know what that class is. And I say there's other ways that it uses, for example, from using aliases or using that autoload class map. Okay, that's about it for this video. Hope you find that useful. Bye for now.